Okay, it's quieted down in our office suite. So we're going to start chapter 5, and that's on page 160 of your textbook. And you notice it's called the integumentary system. That's the skin. And as you come down into the second paragraph, just think about this. We examine the three simplest levels of organization: chemical, cellular, and tissues. Now, when you get to an organ, you put several tissue types together. That's why they call it an organ. So you see it says now we change our focus to the organ and system levels of organization. So having said that, looking at the skin, let's start down at the bottom of this page at 160. You see the learning outcomes. And it talks about the skin doesn't get much respect, but it's important. You know, in some places when people want to hurt someone, they skin them, just like we skin a deer after we've shot it. We're not interested in eating the hair, because you can take the skin of the deer and make it into a garment. But you see it says the skin's the largest organ in the body, and it's got a pretty good weight, 10%, 20 pounds for me probably, in terms of how much it weighs. Don't forget to do your flashbacks. Look back over those things. It's going to keep coming back to you. So we're building on that knowledge. As you look on page 161, you see they also call it a cutaneous membrane. So you see it's got an epidermis, keratinized. Here we are from chapter 4. Keratinized, what does that mean? Okay. Stratified, what does that mean? Squamous, that's 3 descriptive terms. So you want to know that. And you see it says they rest on a basement membrane. Now they really don't show a good basement membrane on the figure 5.1. So don't worry so much about that. It's there. They just didn't draw it like they did back in chapter 4. So it leaves you with a little bit maybe a confusion, but just know it rests on a basement membrane. And you got below that, you have what's called a dermis. And you can see that on the left side of the picture. Epidermis up top, and dermis in the middle. Put a little note under there under where it says dermis and put the word loose connective tissue. It is. It's loose. You can move it all around, push it this way and that way and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So you got the epidermis and the dermis. You come down to the next paragraph. It says that's embedded, epidermis and dermis, with accessory structures. And you see what those are: hair, nails, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, sensory neurons, and even little muscles. Now see, each one of those is a little organ, a little tissue, a little tissue there. So you get all those different ones together, then you got yourself an organ. Now notice in the next paragraph, the epidermis is avascular. And we'll see a little different picture in a little bit, but as you look at the epidermis on page 161, and then you come down to the lighter pink area, that's going to be the dermis, loose connective tissue. And look what's in the connective tissue that's part of the skin. There's a structure, sweat pore, and the sweat, little coil tube, that's the sweat gland. And then you see you have, it doesn't really label it here, but you can, there it is over on the right. They don't label everything in here, but look on the right and you see hair follicle. And you see the hair, you see sebaceous glands, a number of structures working together for the good of this one organ, but it also protects our whole body. Got 10 more organs to protect? So those structures play a role in homeostasis in terms of our body. Notice as you look to the right, and we'll see this again and re-emphasize it, look to the right. See where it says blood vessels? So the blood vessels are in the loose connective tissue. Now, it may not be drawn exactly to scale, and we'll see that it's really not totally acted to scale. But the point is that you got blood vessels down here, and you got to get oxygen to the epidermis. You got to get glucose to the epidermis, not epidermis, excuse me. I'm taking microbiology. I used to teach on. The blood vessels have to pick up the waste and have to give glucose and oxygen off, and it moves from those capillaries, and we'll look at that again in a minute, and the oxygen moves out to the epidermis. Doesn't get all the way through it, but it moves up to the epidermis. Now, why does it move? How about a concentration gradient? See how that's in chapter 1. It's coming right back up again. I'll tell you what, let's just look over at 169 for just a moment. This might help you a little bit. Yeah, look on page 169 for just a second. As you look at the picture, figure 5.5, look on the left-hand side. We're not going to cover the whole thing now, but we'll a little bit later. See where it says papillary layer? See all those little undulations? And you see the little red and blue in there? Those are little capillaries. Those are little vessels that are 1 cell thick. So 1 cell thick means that substances can pass out of the blood into the extracellular fluid and tissue, or waste products can go the other way. Structure and function. Thin, single-celled walls for capillaries so that exchange of nutrition and waste products can take place. And you see they get up close to the epidermis, but they don't get the concentration gradient is not great enough to push the oxygen all the way up, so cells die. Look back on page 161, and you look at the second column, and you see in the first paragraph in the last couple of sentences, it says the superficial. Superficial means on top or outside. Epidermis consists entirely of dead cells. So when you and I look at each other, you're looking at a bunch of dead cells. Okay? So we've got the epidermis, we've got the dermis, and you come to the next paragraph in that second column on 161. And you see it says hypodermis, which means under the dermis. Come down about halfway where you see subcutaneous tissue. That's another name for the hypodermis. But notice in the next sentence, the hypodermis is not actually part of the skin. It anchors the skin to muscle and bone. It's got some collagen fibers and so forth that anchor it to the bone. I think that's got it covered. Okay, let's go over to page 162. And you see the functions of the integumentary system. Just come down and you look at the division of the two columns. One's protection. Yeah, got to be specific with some protection. So you can look at from mechanical trauma, from pathogens. You and I have pathogens all over us, but they don't break through. As long as we take good care of our skin, it's a very good barrier. Some of you are mothers, and you've had your hands in stuff you'd rather not have your hands in. That's just part of being a mother, isn't it? But what'd you do after you cleaned up the mess? Well, go wash your hands. You got most of that stuff off. You're okay. So we get protection from viruses and bacteria. And then you see protection from the environment. You come down to where it says ultraviolet radiation. And as you come down past the third line where it talks about the skin absorbs ultraviolet radiation, the skin also secretes lipid-based chemicals, we'll mention it again, that have non-polar bonds. Okay, those are where they share their electrons They don't just donate them, or they're not off to one side or something like that. And these chemicals repel compounds with polar covalent bonds. You remember how one's hydrophobic and one's hydrophilic? See, you can't get away from that. We can make questions right out of here with what we covered back in chapter 2 about hydrophilic substances and hydrophobic substances. And it says they repel polar covalent bonds. I'm on line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It repels compounds with polar covalent bonds, such as water, and those that have ionic bonds. It has some salt in there or something like that. And notice the next sentence. It's crucial in maintaining water and electrolyte homeostasis in the body by preventing the exit or entrance of water as well as electrolytes. It's not just simply skin. It carries out a number of functions. Look at the last 3 lines. Be aware, however, that these lipid-based substances do allow nonpolar covalent substances to cross the skin. If you read the instructions on some bottles or some products, then you're going to use it to clean something. A lot of times they'll use a nonpolar compound. Those can seep through your skin and you can have some problems. So read the instructions. They'll tell you if you get anything on your skin, wash it off as quickly as you can. Sensation. We'll see in just a few minutes that there are receptors. You remember we talked about neurons in chapter 4. And so there are receptors that pick up sensations in the environment. I want you to read this again about thermoregulation. You already have a simplified circuit in terms of handling the body temperature. But look over here at page 163, and you see up there at the top, body temperature increases above normal. This would be a stimulus. Receptor picks that up, sends a message from the receptor. See, we're getting neurons involved in this now. And they send through the nerves, they send it to the hypothalamus. They call it the regulatory center in the brain. And your brain sends a message back through the nerves, and you either start sweating or your blood vessels dilate. You ever had your eyes dilated? That's what we're talking about. Pupil gets big, doesn't it? You got to put on some kind of sunshade after you've had your eyes checked like that. So the blood vessels dilate, and warm blood from the inside gets out in those capillaries, and heat is released. You can actually feel it on some people after they have exercised, or some people just are really warm-blooded anyway. They put out heat all the time. But the heat is released and the temperature comes back down. Now you can come down to the bottom of the half of the picture and you can look through that. Think your way through it. Think in terms of a sequence of events that keeps our temperature at about 98 degrees. On page 164, excretion is the releasing of wastes. We don't think of our sweat necessarily being a waste, but it does contain small amounts of what they call urea and lactic acid. So those are considered wastes. So we have some excretion by our sweat glands. And by the way, you can't get cool on a hot day in South Carolina because the humidity is up here around 85%. And so if the water doesn't evaporate, you just get sticky and wet. That's one reason we have air conditioning down here. I've got a friend, they live up there in Michigan, or used to live there, and they don't have air conditioning. It just doesn't get that hot or humid, at least normally. So down here, we need the air conditioner. You're going to get one in your car, you're going to get one in your house, just so you can stay dry. Come on down in the first column on 164, and you see vitamin D synthesis. that's an interesting study on that. We're still learning about vitamin D, but they say if you're going to take some vitamin D, it's absorbed better if you take it with a meal that has some fat in it. And you could drink it with a glass of milk, and that would help. Or if you eat some kind of meat, a pork loin or some chicken or something like that, then it helps. You can eat it with nuts. You got some oils in nuts. So, and those are called fats, types of triglycerides. Remember, monounsaturated and so forth, fatty acids. So notice it says the precursor. I want you to look that up and tell me what that is. The precursor of vitamin D is a compound similar to cholesterol. There's another reason we need cholesterol. What's the other reason? We talked about it in the previous chapters. See how this is coming all around? You got to read over your notes. Don't tell me you haven't read over your notes. I'm telling you to do it. Don't forget it. And you see it says it's in the deeper part of the epidermis. And when ultraviolet radiation hits it, it converts that precursor into cholecalciferol. That's something to wake up in the morning and try and say it 10 times, isn't it? They can also call it vitamin D3. But anyway, notice what happens. It's not through being processed and formulated so that it's going to help you. Converted to the inactive cholecalciferol, which then enters the bloodstream. Comes from the skin into the bloodstream to form calcitriol, the active form of vitamin D. Now notice it says vitamin D is required for the small intestine to absorb calcium. Okay? To absorb calcium. That's one reason we need a little bit of sun. The doctors told me my D level was a little bit low. So they said, just go out 2 or 3 times a week and sit out there for about 10 or 15 minutes. That's it. So on days that the sun's good, I'll go out there and take my shirt off and pick up 10, 12 minutes of rays or something like that. And they even say that helps you fight off COVID. Don't understand the connection, but vitamin D they call it a vitamin, but there are groups of scientists who are moving away from that now, thinking of it as a vitamin. They're thinking of it more as a hormone, a steroid type hormone. We're always learning. Don't ever think we got it all figured out. That's one of the nice things about this. We keep learning. So anyway, you got the idea where it says calcium plays a role in nerve function, muscle contraction, bone tissue. Calcium's pretty tough stuff. We need some of that. So you can look that up, and where do you get your sources? Most of us would think of milk, and that's good. And if you got whole milk, like they told me to start drinking whole milk, you got your fat in there. That helps you absorb any vitamin D. And of course, the milk we usually buy is vitamin D fortified. So that can actually help, since we're not always out in the garden hoeing potatoes and carrots and things like that. So now we come over to the epidermis, module 5.2 on 164. And you can see the learning outcomes. And as you come down into the paragraph, it says the epidermis, the most superficial. What does that mean? The most superficial part of our skin. What does it mean? Although the epidermis contains several types of cells, the most numerous are keratinocytes. Keratinocytes. And you see the flashback down below. Now, as you look up at the top on page 165, you see there's this paragraph. Starts with the word approximately. 2 structural features of keratinocytes. Know those 2 features. What's the difference compositionally between those 2 substances that they're going to talk about? I'll let you figure that out. It's not hard, but I'm trying to get you to think and piece things together so you have a greater understanding. Now, you come to this section where they have the layers. And if you've had 110, you probably remember that you had to memorize those. And so here are the layers. They got them all written out for you. And you can, you want to know the layers. And you want to, for instance, the stratum basal, single layer of stem cells that rest on a basement membrane, but they don't draw a basement membrane in there like they did back in 4. It's hard for people to be consistent. But then Mr. Malachowski will read something, I'll read something. I said, wait a minute, that's not, they don't show the connections there. This is different one they showed back in chapter 4 or whatever. We're not perfect, but we can still help people and get paid for it. Just we try to be consistent. It's a tough job sometimes. So anyway, the stratum basal, bottom layer. And you see, as you come down under stratum basal, it'll tell you that that's the basal layer. And the keratinocytes in this layer are closest to the blood supply. So they're active in growing. We're always producing cells in our skin all the time. Some of you girls exfoliate, I guess you'd call it. My wife does that. I don't. I just take a shower, get in the bed, and go to sleep. But kind of glad I'm not a girl that had to do all that stuff. But whatever, you girls do it. And so they're near the blood supply. And notice you come down about halfway in that first paragraph. It says these cells produce the vitamin D. So there's that hormone, even though some people still keep calling it a vitamin. That's okay. We know what we're talking about. And they have another name for the stratum basal. You see it says stratum germinativum. You germinate a seed. That means it opens up and starts growing. So this is the layer of tissue where cells are replicating. They are growing and keep pushing up because we're always losing our epidermal cells. So we come up to the next one, or in this case it's down on the column, but it's the next one up, stratum spinosum, because it has little spines on it whenever they make a slide of it. That's basically why. Now, if you look on page 166, if you come down into this little paragraph, first column, come about halfway, it says, like the cells of the stratum basal, those of the stratum spinosum are near the blood supply, so they're actively dividing also. And then it says, sometimes classed as part of the stratum germinativum. They also help produce vitamin D. So you got 2 rows of cells in a sense. They're all the same cells. They started at the stratum basal and they work their way up, but they're still producing vitamin D. The third layer, granulosum, says like it ought to have granules in it, doesn't it? And it does. If you come down in the first column, you see it says there are 2 types of granules in the cell. One are keratin bundles. What does keratin do for us? It's a protein, and then the other is a lipid-based substance. Now, when you read the next paragraph, it's going to tell you that keratinocytes release the lipid-based substance by exocytosis, And that was covered back in chapter 3, wasn't it? Again, see how we keep building? It ain't going to stop. Got to stay up with it. The more you read it, the more you look through over the notes and just read them, think about them, and you go, oh, the picture's coming together. It works, but you have to do things over and over again. It's just like being an athlete. You get better and better. Of course, you reach your peak or something like that. But when you start out, you didn't have the skills, but now you do. Anyway, come down about 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. It says, remember that lipids are hydrophobic, fear of water, meaning they do not interact with hydrophilic, okay, those that like water. So the lipid coating acts as a water barrier. It helps. You'll also, if you look for the function of keratin, which we think of as a tissue that makes our tissue tougher. It's a tough protein, takes a lot of scruffing and rubbing and so forth and bumping up against stuff. But this lipid-based substance, and they say the keratin does it too. In other books, they'll say they both of them help to waterproof your skin. And that's important so you don't lose water and water doesn't come in terms of making you soggy or anything like that. Now, the next layer in the second column, you see is stratum lucidum, and you find that on the palms of your hands. You don't find it on the backside or over here, up on top of your head or whatever. But you have it on the bottom of your feet and toes, and you have it on the bottom of your palms or on your palms and on your fingers. So that takes care of that layer. Otherwise, we only have 4 layers. But here we have 5. You can actually, if you're allergic to poison ivy, you can pick up poison ivy, pull it out, put it on the ground. Now, it is not going to bother you because it can't make it through the stratum lucidum. Good thing to do if you ever grab it, go in and wash with cold water, get some soap going real good and wash it real well. Just don't rub your eyes or put them somewhere on your body where you might run into a problem because you can transfer the oil in poison ivy to another part of your body. Best thing to do is really just wear some gloves. But you got the stratum corneum, and it says those cells, if you read through there, they're flat. So there's a lot of them up there, and they've lost their normal organelles. That means they probably have lost their Golgi apparatus and the ribosomes and so forth. They've lost their normal organelles, and they're now just basically bundles of keratin with thick plasma membranes. And notice it says the most superficial cells of the stratum corneum have already lost their desmosomes. You will have read about that. I asked you to read about that. You remember desmosomes hold cells together. But now those proteins are breaking down. And notice what it says. You shed cells all the time. I take this shirt off, and if I look at it under the microscope, I'd see all these epithelial cells that are coming off of my body. If we had the right photographer, with the right camera, the right light, you could see cells falling off of you. It's pretty interesting. We're pretty flaky people. And tonight, when you crawl in that bed, and I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but you're going to rub all over those sheets and you're going to leave cells in there. And they're little mites, tiny little mites that are in the bed with you. So when you think you're alone, just don't worry about it. You're not alone. I don't know that they would jump up and fight for you, anything like that, but they like to eat your cells. And then, of course, while they eat your cells, you'll learn as a nurse, there's such things called input, output, whether it's water in the food and stuff like that for a person in the hospital. So those little guys eat it, and then they defecate in your bed. So you crawl in those sheets, and you're sleeping amongst a bunch of mites and mite manure. We think we're so clean, don't we? Yeah. Life is all around us. We still haven't discovered it all. That's part of the fun of this stuff. Some people are allergic to the fecal material that they dump out, so that's a challenge for them and get it in their nose and it bothers them. Doesn't slow me down, so I'm very thankful. On page 167, down at the bottom, do your quick check, and then you see other cells of the epidermis. And here they list 3 of them. We'll see some more in a little bit. 2 names for these one of these cells. Those are phagocytes. Phagocytes do what? How do they help us? Merkel cells, notice that they're little sensory receptors. And as you read through there, it says it helps to detect light touch. Light touch. That's like when you're sitting on the front porch and you feel something just barely touching the hair or the skin. And you look down there and here's this old mosquito. And you just slowly get over there if you can and pop, squish him, throw him away and keep enjoying your time out on the porch. Anyway, they pick up sensations. And then melanocytes, they're the ones that produce a substance called melanin that protects us from UV radiation. here we go out to get some radiation for vitamin D, and then we need a substance to protect us from it. So homeostasis, okay? He told me that, I told you, 12, 15 minutes twice, 3 times a week or something like that. But some people say, well, that'll help me. I know I'll go out here 7 days a week and do this stuff. You don't need to do that. You can overload systems and you end up maybe getting skin cancer. What the homeostatic mechanism is, we're not totally sure, but that's what mine said. My physician said, get some sun, 12, 15 minutes, twice, 3 times a week, something like that. Changes the color of your skin a little bit. Now we come over to, as you see, thick and thin skin on 167. And the thick skin is what we have on our hands, stratum lucidum, and on the on the bottom of our feet. Now, you already know the rest of the skin would be called thin skin, 4 layers versus 5. I want you to look at the last paragraph on 167, second column. And you see it says, in both thick and thin skin, the stratum corneum may develop additional layers when subjected to repeated pressure and form a callus. Have you ever had a callus on maybe one of your toes because the shoe was not as fitting as it should be, but you liked them a lot and you were going to wear them, and next thing you know, you got yourself a callus on your little toe or something like that, or maybe on your big toe. So the callus is a little thickening of the skin. Down there where it says how, at the bottom of that column, how do thick and thin skin differ? Well, we already know that, but how many of you play a stringed instrument? Guitar, mandolin, cello, violin. If you have, you probably had calluses build up on the tips of your fingers because you're always putting pressure on a string. I've got little calluses here, little thickened areas that I don't have over here because that's where I hold down the strings on a mandolin and a guitar as I try to learn how to play this stuff. Anyway, that's a couple of ways to get calluses. Okay, we're going to go for maybe, I'll tell you what, we're going to stop right here. That's 32 minutes. And we'll come back with another video next week, starting on page 168 on the dermis. All right. So we have done another lecture. And let's see if I can push this up. There we go. Now I can hit the end. And we'll see you guys whenever.